In the Field, Part 2, starting with page 166. Across the field, Azar and Norman Bowker and Mitchell Sanders were waiting alongside a narrow dike at the edge of the field. It was now near noon. Norman Bowker found Kiowa. He was under 2 feet of water. Nothing showed except the heel of a boot. "That's him?" Azar said. "Who else?" "I don't know." Azar shook his head. "I don't know." Norman Bowker touched the boot, covered his eyes for a moment, then stood up and looked at Azar. "So where's the joke?" he said. "No joke." "Eating shit, let's hear that one." "Forget it." Mitchell Sanders told them to knock it off. The 3 soldiers moved to the dike, put down their packs and weapons, and then waded back to where the boot was showing. The body was partly wedged under a layer of mud beneath the water. It was hard to get traction. With each movement the muck would grip their feet and hold tight. The rain had come back harder now. Mitchell Sanders reached down and found Kiowa's other boot. They waited for a moment. Then Sanders sighed and said, "Okay." And they took hold of the 2 boots and pulled up hard. There was only a slight give. They had tried again, but this time the body did not move at all. After the 3rd try, they stopped and looked down for a while. "One more time," Norman Bowker said. He counted to 3, and they leaned back and pulled. "Stuck," said Mitchell Sanders. "I see that." They tried again, then called over Henry Dobbins and Rat Kiley, and all 5 of them put their arms and backs into it, but the body was jammed in tight. Azar moved to the dike and sat holding his stomach. His face was pale. The others stood in a circle, watching the water. Then after a time somebody said, "We can't just leave him there." And the men nodded and got out their entrenching tools and began digging. It was hard, sloppy work. The mud seemed to slow back faster than they could dig. But Kiowa was their friend, and they kept at it anyway. Slowly, in little groups, the rest of the platoon drifted over to watch. Only Lieutenant Jimmy Cross and the young soldier were still searching the field. "What we should do, I guess," Norman Bowker said, "is tell the LT." Mitchell Sanders shook his head. "Just mess things up. Besides, the man looks happy out there, real content. Let him be." After 10 minutes they uncovered most of Kiowa's lower body. The corpse was angled steeply in the muck, upside down, like a diver who'd plunged headfirst off a high tower. The men stood quietly for a second. There was a feeling of awe. Mitchell Sanders finally nodded and said, "Let's get it done." And they took hold of the legs and pulled up hard, then pulled again, and after a moment Kiowa came sliding to the surface. A piece of his shoulder was missing. The arms and chest and face were cut up with shrapnel. He was covered with bluish-green mud. "Well," Henry Dobbins said, "it could be worse." And Dave Jensen said, "How, man? Tell me how." Carefully, trying not to look at the body, they carried Kiowa over to the dike and laid him down. They used towels to clean off the scum. Rat Kiley went through the kid's pockets, placed his personal effects in a plastic bag, taped the bag to Kiowa's wrist, and then used the radio to call in a dust-off. Moving away, the men found things to do with themselves, some smoking, some opening up cans of sea rations, and a few just standing in the rain. For all of them it was a relief to have it finished. There was the promise now of finding a hooch somewhere, or an abandoned pagoda, where they could strip down and wring out their fatigues, and maybe start a hot fire. They felt bad for Kiowa, but they also felt kind of giddiness, a secret joy, because they were alive, and because even the rain was preferable to being sucked under a shit field, and because it was all a matter of luck and happenstance. Azar sat down on the dike next to Norman Bowker. "Listen," he said. "Those dumb jokes, I didn't mean anything. We all say things. Yeah, but when I saw the guy, it made me feel, I don't know, like he was listening." "He wasn't." "I guess not, but I felt sort of guilty almost. Like if I'd kept my mouth shut, none of it would have happened. Like it was my own fault." Norman Bowker looked out across the wet field. "Nobody's fault," he said. "Everybody's." Near the center of the field, First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross squatted in the muck, almost entirely submerged. In his head he was revising the letter to Kiowa's father, impersonal this time. An officer expressing an officer's condolences. No apologies were necessary, because in fact it was one of those freak things, and the war was full of freaks, and nothing could ever change it anyway. Which was the truth, he thought. The exact truth. Lieutenant Cross went deeper into the muck, the dark water at his throat, and he tried to tell himself it was the truth. Behind him, a few steps off to the left, the young soldier was still searching for his girlfriend's picture, still remembering how he had killed Kiowa. The boy wanted to confess. He wanted to tell the lieutenant how in the middle of the night he'd pulled out Billy's picture, passed it over to Kiowa, and then switched on the flashlight, and how Kiowa whispered, "Hey, she's cute," and how for a second the flashlight had made Billy's face sparkle, and how right then the field had exploded all around them. The flashlight had done it, like a target shining in the dark. The boy looked up at the sky and then at Jimmy Cross. "Sir?" he said. The rain and mist moved across the field in broad, sweeping sheets of gray. Close by there was thunder. "Sir," the boy said, "I gotta explain something." But Lieutenant Jimmy Cross wasn't listening. Eyes closed, he let himself go deeper in the waste, just letting the field take him. He lay back and floated. When a man died, there had to be blame. Jimmy Cross understood this. You could blame the war. You could blame the idiots who made the war. You could blame Kiowa for going to it. You could blame the rain. You could blame the river. You could blame the field, the mud, the climate. You could blame the enemy. You could blame the mortar rounds. You could blame people who were too lazy to read a newspaper, who were too bored by the daily body counts, who switched channels at the mention of politics. You could blame whole nations. You could blame God. You could blame the munitions makers or Karl Marx, or a trick of fate, or an old man in Omaha who forgot to vote. In the field, though, the causes were immediate. A moment of carelessness or bad judgment or plain stupidity carried consequences that lasted forever. For a long while Jimmy Cross lay floating. In the clouds to the east there was the sound of a helicopter, but he did not take notice. His eyes still closed, bobbing in the field, he let himself slip away. He was back home in New Jersey, a golden afternoon on the golf course, the fairways lush and green, and he was teeing it up at on the first hole. It was a world without responsibility. When the war was over, he thought, maybe then he would write a letter to Kiowa's father. Or maybe not. Maybe he would just take a couple practice swings and knock the ball down the middle and pick up his clubs and walk off into the afternoon.